Welcome to the 1600 Sessions. I'm Stuart McLaurin, president of the White House Historical Association. The White House is known for its sparkling musical evenings and brilliant visiting performers. Outstanding singers and musicians bring their talents to the stage of the White House, entertaining guests at special concerts, state dinners, and often millions through broadcasts such as with the historic In Performance at the White House series. But little is known about the private music options and listening habits of recent American presidents. It would make sense that the person with the most demanding job in the world should have a wealth of recordings available at the drop of a hat. But no such thing existed until quite recently. And the story of the White House Record Library was almost forgotten in a secret storage place, except for one curious presidential family member. John Sheldinko is a successful Los Angeles-based writer and filmmaker. He's also the grandson of President Jimmy Carter and Mrs. Carter. And although John wasn't present at the White House during the Carter presidency, John is the source of one of the most intriguing and nearly forgotten tales of modern White House and its history. So let's explore the story behind this rediscovered treasure. Well, John, welcome to the 1600 Sessions. It's great to have you here.
It's great to be here, and it's great to meet you and the team.
Well, tell us how you learned about this very special collection, and how did your grandfather access it and use it?
My grandparents have always had a very special connection to music, and I think that probably started in the church. You know, it continued throughout the campaign when rock and roll musicians like the Allman Brothers and others would mobilize to get out the youth vote during the campaign. He's also got a very impressive knowledge of classical and jazz music that would impress even record store clerks. I mean, it's really interesting. But music brings them both a lot of joy. You can see it when they dance at weddings. You can see it at home. You can see it in these moments where music plays and they instantly get up and there's that light in their eyes. So it's no wonder that they would take that love for music into the White House with them. You know, I found out about the collection on one of our family trips. So we'll go somewhere different in the world. And we were sitting around one night and my uncles were telling stories about their time in the White House. And there was my Uncle Jeff was telling me there was a state dinner going on and sort of a big to-do downstairs, but there's an elevator that could take you from the first floor up to the residence, right? And there's a solarium up there where people would hang out, where the sort of a very casual family room, if you will. So he had brought some friends up there and they were hanging out in the solarium and they were playing records and having a good time and rocking out, right? Until he said, he turned around, the music was really loud, he turned around and his mom, First Lady at the time, and Mrs. Mondale, he said, were there, and the music was blaring, and he said, they didn't stay very long at that party. So he tells that story, and I asked him, I said, well, how did that work? Did you bring your own records? Was there a record player up there? He said, oh yeah, there was a record player up there. And like anybody else, yeah, sometimes you bring your own records, or if you wanted something new, you could call somebody that would go get it for you. And he said, but there were also records there. I said, well, what do you mean there were also records there? He said, yeah, there was a shelf with a library of records there. And I'm a big music nerd, record collector. There are records in the White House, Jeff? And he said, yeah. And then so I start researching, right? So I start looking. And surprisingly, there was not much to be found about this White House record library. There were two catalogs that the White House Historical Association had published, which were really more just catalogs of the records included, right? And then there was a couple articles in Billboard magazine in the early 90s and a piece from 2009 in Rolling Stone magazine. And that was pretty much it. So now my interest is piqued. I'm like, well, the White House record library. So that's what really started my search.
Well, we think of libraries, of course, with books, and there is a treasure trove of books in the White House library, and that's something that has grown over the years. But it wasn't until the 70s, 1973, during the Nixon presidency, interestingly enough, that this records library began, as I understand it, and the Recording Industry of America, I think, contributed 2,000 or so LPs and some stereo equipment. What do we know about that and how that came to be and why the Nixon presidency?
The Recording Industry Association had known of the book library, like you said. They said, well, if they're books, there should also be music. Music is a cultural representation of the tastes and people of the country. So they got together and put together a panel of experts, each with expertise in a specific genre: classical, jazz, Country, folk, and gospel was one selection, spoken word, and then popular recordings. And they chose a chairperson for each of those categories. Willis Conover, who was the Voice of America broadcaster, did the jazz. Johnny Mercer, the famous songwriter, did the popular music selections at the time. And the project was initially sort of brought up in '69, but started research in earnest in the spring of 1970. So they would get together and choose each curator would make their selections and then bring them to the whole panel, for inclusion. But it was always intended as a communication device, a way for the president to literally hear what was going on musically in the country at the time, what the people were listening to, what was popular at the time.
I've heard President Carter say that a year leading up to the inauguration, when the hostages were held captive, that he stayed mostly in the White House and reflected in prayer and contemplation about the decisions that were in front of him. Wonder what music he would have listened to during that very serious, thoughtful time when he was focused on these very heavy issues of state.
Well, he told me that he was deeply affected by Bob Dylan's music. So I wonder if some of that was present as well. It is in the record library, I can tell you that.
Well, where is that library physically kept? We talked about those who curated the collection to begin with, but then it made its way to the White House, and there's this shelf that you mentioned. The curators of the wonderful White House curatorial team that handle these priceless objects and art in the White House, are they the ones that also handle this collection?
Yes, it is the purview of the Office of the Curator. So when I first found out about it, I started doing my research. Where do you start? Well, you can't. There's a phone number for the White House. You can call the White House. You know what I mean? But I didn't want to be transferred to the Department of Crackpots. Who's this guy? So I got a phone number through one of the archivists at my grandfather's library at the cards. But that was all I started with, one phone number, right? So I talk to this gentleman, explain the White House Record Library, and it's a cool story. I think people genuinely want to help because it's an interesting topic. So a few days go by, and he's like, well, I found somebody. Here, call the Office of the Curator, talk to this person. Her name was Monica at the time. And so I call Monica. I explain the whole situation. There's a record library, and it was there, and it was curated, and then it was updated. And she says, okay. And in my head, she's listened to the Stones. It's right there next to her. Of course, it's not. So she says, well, we'll get back to you, basically. Turns out, though, 3-4 days later, I get an email, and it's, with the EXOP email, the real White House email address, and it says, John, yes, we've located the White House Record Library. It's in a secure, undisclosed storage facility, so we can't tell you where it is.
And it's a nuclear secret.
Exactly, right? I'm just vibrating. What do you reply? I'm like, well, okay, this is it. Now it's here's the proof that it exists, right? This is the moment in Raiders of the Lost Ark when Indiana Jones takes the medallion, puts it on the staff, and sticks it in the thing, and you can see where the beam is. Now I know it exists somewhere, right? What do I reply back? So you think I could come see it? Send that up. And she replies with, well, it's kind of a long process. The First Lady has to approve it. It's a whole thing. But I'm undeterred at this point. At this point, there is a record collection. There's what could possibly the most exclusive record collection on the planet that is designed for the personal use of the president, and it exists. I was just, my hooks were, I was in on this. So a long process, the approval process starts, and I get an email months later. The First Lady has approved your request to come see it, and now the wheels are rolling.
And which First Lady would this have been?
This is Michelle Obama. Okay. Yeah. And so what am I going to do? I put together a team. I brought. During my research, I'd looked up everybody who was on these selection committees, and everybody has deceased from the first one. The second one, most people are, but I found Bob Blumenthal, who was the curator of the popular music selection in Volume 2. So I bring Bob. I brought the author of the Rolling Stone piece and a camera crew, about 2 camera operators and a sound person, to go document this unveiling. Well, it's December's rolling around, right? So the White House is full of government employees. They want to go home. They want to go on vacation with their families. Sure. So it's pretty quiet there, and we're setting up the thing. But it happened to be during one of those times where there was a threatened government shutdown. I can't remember if it was a budget impasse or a debt ceiling thing, but it was touch and go whether the government would be shut down. And so Monica from the curator's office calls me. She said, listen, if this is shut down, we lock the doors. You can't come. So now I've got skin in the game. Now I'm watching CNN like, oh, is it going to happen? Is it not? I've got everybody on the phone. Turns out it's December 21st, right around the holidays, and it's a go. And we all get our background checks and all the clearances, and we go to Washington to see this collection. In volume 2, from what Bob told me, the curator, by the time they sourced all the records and everything, it wasn't really until January of 1981 when my grandfather had lost the election. So he said when they showed up for the presentation ceremony, there were bleachers on Pennsylvania Avenue. There were moving vans in the driveway. Mm-hmm. So, and I asked him, well, did you ever actually see the records? And he said, I don't remember actually seeing the records. So they may have not actually been moved in at the time. They were selected, sourced, ready to go, matching the initial 1973 library. But possibly not. They could have just sort of been in a van and then gone off to the storage facility. So I'm the only, quite possibly me and my team are the only person to ever see them.
Wow. Well, I'm going to make an endeavor to see them now. So I think our audience will be seeing the images, some of the images that you've taken, but now I'm totally intrigued. Well, obviously, music, taste, style, genre, all shift, changes, evolves over the years. Could you tell if there was an attempt to update the collection or keep it evolving as those tastes and interests changed?
Well, there was, and that was always the intention from the first library, from Pat Nixon, who wanted to keep it as a living collection to constantly be updated. When the recording, there were two factors. When the RIAA saw that there was somebody who actually likes music in the White House, and then looked at the volume 1 of the collection, they really saw an opportunity there to do a volume 2, to update it. Like I said, Johnny Mercer was the curator of the popular music selection. Rock and roll was encompassed into the popular music selection. Johnny Mercer, as you know, incredible songwriter, Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe, Autumn Leaves. He wrote the lyrics to Moon River. I mean, the guy, prolific songwriter. Maybe not so into the rock and roll. Maybe not. He's the guy you go to if you know what the best Stones record is. Fair enough. So I think the popular music section was probably a big reason that they wanted to update this. And they did. They put together a new panel of curators, this time headed by John Hammond, president of Columbia. John signed Bob Dylan, credited with discovering Aretha Franklin, signed Bruce Springsteen, legendary in the music industry, and then put together a list of people. John Lewis of the Modern Jazz Quartet curated the jazz selections. They were looking for somebody for the popular music selections. Well, the jazz, they reached out to a guy named Bob Blumenthal, who is a young reporter in Boston for the Boston Phoenix, and he's more of a jazz guy. So he says, John, I'm a jazz guy. You want me to do the popular rock and roll? And he said he knew just enough to be dangerous, just enough to do a bad job at this. But he called on a team of advisors to help with his selections. And they would meet monthly in New York City. And they would get together and make their selections and then have a spirited debate about it. They would say, hey, I want to put in this record. No, you can't put in that one. You got to do this one. And they would gather around and bat things back and forth. And eventually the whole panel had to agree upon all of these submissions, all these selections. And after, he told me, after these meetings, they would meet at a French restaurant down in the theater district in New York, and John Hammond would just tell them stories for the rest of the night. It was like lunch meetings would go into dinner meetings, and it was a really special experience. But when you look at volume 2, when you contrast volume 1 and volume 2, okay, so there's a lot of Don Ho. There's a lot of Lawrence Welk. There's some of the more sort of a lot of standards and things like that, which are great. The number of Beatles albums is equal to the number of Pat Boone albums, which I think in hindsight, and you don't want to be armchair quarterback, you don't want to judge, but in hindsight, we could all sort of agree, and especially by 1970, the Beatles had done the majority of their work, right? So there's no excuse that you could have everything there. So they rectified some of those omissions that may have been present there, and there's some fantastic stuff in there.
Do you have any idea if the artists did they know their works were in this White House collection? Would that have been shared with them, you think?
No, I don't think so. I think in volume 1, there were not any artists on the selection panels. There was Tex Ritter, the country music artist, was consulted in volume 1.
Obviously, your playlist and my playlist would say a lot about our personalities and our interests. What does the collection that you saw at the White House say about the presidency and the White House itself? Were there any conclusions that you drew either about specific presidents or about the collection on the whole?
It's very reflective of the time. When they started, and basically reflective of the 70s, from the end of the last, from 1970 when they started the volume 1 until 1979 when they started volume 2, and went through and filled in some of the gaps. But there are records that are in there that are provocative and political. There are protest albums in there. But for every Ramones album, the first Clash record is in there. Elvis Costello's in there. Dylan that collection has been filled out. There's Blonde on Blonde in there. There's Blood on the Tracks in there. Freewheelin' is in there. But for all that, there's also ABBA, and there's also Macho Man from the Village People is in there. So there are some surprises. And then you dig through this collection and you see how these little, I call them like crystal ball selections. Like the volume 1 includes Elton John's self-titled album, and this is 1970. So who would know that he would go on to have an incredibly prolific career later on? I mean, somebody saw some promise in that kid early at the time, right? And there's stuff that were sort of, one-hit wonders, and there's all kinds of things in there. You make the best choices you can at the time, but it's really a collection. When you think about, does it reflect the presidency? More so it reflects the people, the American people, and it acts as a communication device of what's going on outside on Pennsylvania Avenue, what's going on outside in the country, what are the people really listening to?
Well, so much of the music of the 70s was message-based and political and controversial and provocative. Yeah. And what an interesting thing it would have been for President Nixon, President Carter to feel the emotions and the challenges that were being conveyed through music of the time.
Oh, absolutely. For us, they moved the record collection into, they were going to move it into the tea room. Tea room was being used, this is around the holidays, tea room was being used for some event. So they say, would it be okay to move it into the movie theater? Yes, of course. You can put it in the driveway for all I care. I'm going to come look at these records. So there we are. We show up at the White House. We walk into the movie theater. It's on the first floor. And there they are. There these records are. And they're in these cardboard boxes just kind of stacked up by the screen. And it was like Christmas morning,
Oh,
I brought Bob, I brought his advisor, Kit Rackless, who were both involved in the selection committee. And they just ran over to these boxes and were digging stuff out. And we're like, oh, I found The Who. It's like, oh, I found the Woodstock soundtrack. Oh, I found Van Morrison. And they had a little folding table out there, and we would just lay out all these records. What are records without a record player? So, the process was so involved, the approval process and everything was so involved that I didn't particularly ask, can I bring a turntable? But these records are designed to be played. These records were curated, sourced at great effort from all the record labels to be put into this library for the sole purpose of being played in this house. And here I am, the only person to ever see these records in this house that they were intended to be played. You gotta bring a turntable, right? So I brought my little luggage, my wheeled case, with a turntable, little powered speakers, little preamp, folding tables up there, and we set them all up there and stuff like that. And we're looking at all these records. So yeah, at some point we got to play them.
Well, the Nixons, the Carters, and the Fords all had at least one child with them in the White House during those years. Any indication that the listening interest or musical interest of those children played into the collection, or would they have accessed this collection, or is it restricted only to the president?
Oh no, it's upstairs in the residence. It's upstairs there with the turntable, and it's all there for the personal enjoyment of the first family. Mrs. Nixon requested that a duplicate copy also be installed somewhere for the public. That ended up being in a performing arts library at the Kennedy Center. That I have not been able to track down what happened to that duplicate copy yet, but I'm on the hunt.
Great, we'll help you with that.
Oh, great, fantastic.
Well, as the way we listen to music clearly has changed over the years, and the digitization of music and the accessibility of it is instantly now. How has that impacted not only this collection, but the way presidents listen to music and access it? Is there still this treasure trove that is updated and used by presidents?
Bill Clinton was obviously a big music fan. He probably enjoyed his music on CDs. Obama, was super into his iPad. He would run with it and exercise with it. Nowadays, even the idea of while vinyl is experiencing an incredible resurgence.
Sure.
The idea for physical media, I can understand the debate around that. I mean, listen, as a record nerd, would I love to reinstall 3,000 or so records back up in the White House? Totally. I acknowledge that's probably a big ask,
yes.
But I think now more than ever, the time to reinvigorate the White House Record Library. Think about it. It stopped in 1980. There's nothing from 1980 to today. So that's 40 years or so. Think about the music that's happened there. There's no rap or hip hop. There's no electronic music. There are no boy bands, no Madonna, no Prince. So what better time to fill in that huge gap? You think about the music that was made over those last 40 years. It's significant, right? And if you go back and think about the initial, if you go back and think about the initial reason for this collection as a way for the president and first family to understand what's going on in the climate of the American people, I can't think of a better time to reinvigorate this collection. You know what I mean? As a communication device.
So, John, you're down in the family theater on the ground floor of the White House, and you're listening to these records on this turntable that you brought. What did you listen to? What was the first thing you grabbed that you wanted to listen to?
Yeah, so it's a big decision, right? These records had not been seen by anyone. These records had certainly not been played. They are all pristine. And I should talk about what they look like. So we go down there. They're all in these cardboard storage boxes, like the kind of boxes you get like when you get fired from a movie, like in the office, right? They're just stacked in there. And they're all color-coded by genre. There's red ones, there's yellow ones are the spoken word, red is classical, light blue is the rock and roll and the popular things. So like I said, like Christmas morning, we're down there, we're pulling things out, and we lay sort of our just noteworthy records or stuff we were interested in on this folding table. And Blonde on Blonde is there, and it's it's got the gatefold, big, the cover that opens up. Blood on the Tracks is there. We've got Neil Young's Decade there. We've got the Woodstock soundtrack there. We've got Who's Next on there. The first Clash record is there. Elvis Costello is there. Honky Chateau from Elton John is there. We sort of laid out these albums. And meanwhile, Bob and Kit are talking about the selection process and what they were, what it was like to debate these records and include some and not include others. And I was like, well, I got the turntable there, so what are we going to play? And then it sort of, I think there was a pause and the gravity of the situation hit us that no one had ever played these records, which is always a little bit special. No one had ever played the White House record library records in the White House at this time. We're all kind of like, all right, what are we doing there? And we look over, and Van Morrison's Astral Weeks is there. And that's an incredibly special record. I mean, Lester Bangs wrote about it extensively. Bruce Springsteen called it the record that made him believe in the divine. I mean, it was really, people really respect this album. One of my favorites, clearly. And the first, it's the title track is the first song. It has a nice little pace to it. A rock album, I guess you could call it, but made with jazz musicians. So we take it out of the sleeve and we put it down on the turntable and we play it. And it sounded great. It's an isolated room. It's a movie theater, so the sound was pretty good. And the first lyrics come on, and it's lay me down in silence, easy to be born again. And then when you think about that gravity, yes, these records have really been now played, and now are experiencing a second life, the life they were always intended to have. In this room in the White House where they were designed to be played. It was a really profound moment, I think, for all of us. We just sort of sat there and listened to it for a while.
Well, you have shared with us an extraordinary story. I have to ask you about these books that are right here in front of you. Tell us about these.
Yeah, absolutely. So the White House Historical Association had, and this was key to my research, they had published 2 books, which are really more reference catalogs of the record library. And in the back, they've got all of the recordings listed with the label, catalog numbers, artists. And in the front, there's a little introduction from each of the curators. Bob Blumenthal wrote something: if the music at times seems crude, brash, and preoccupied with the unspeakable and the intimate, it is also bold, assured, self-confident, vulnerable, visionary, a peculiarly American synthesis, which has been heard and is now created internationally. Wow. You know what I mean? It shows that, there's some stuff in here that your grandparents may not like. I mean, the Sex Pistols is in here. The first Clash record is in here. Rocket to Russia is in here. Frank Zappa is in here. But that's important. It's important to hear those things. It was just so wonderful to be in the people's house, in the White House, with something like the first Clash record, with something like all these incredible recordings. They're meant to send a message,
Well, thank you for sharing this incredible story with us. For our followers of the 1600 sessions, I'm going to make sure these are digitized and put on our digital library so anyone interested can see the content of these books. But you have unpacked a fascinating story that is an insight into the life of a president and first lady, the music interest. When we think of these people living in this White House and facing decisions of intense consequence domestically and internationally, but to think that they also have personal lives and family lives, and that the music that they listen to would have been thought about and made accessible to them in such an important way. And this is such a treasure trove of history. And thank you for sharing this really great story with us.
Oh, you're welcome. It's a dream of mine. It really felt like an Indiana Jones crusade to uncover this, and to share it with the world is fantastic.
This is not the end of this story.
No.
We're going to keep the ball rolling with you and see if
Absolutely.
we can be a help to take this story further. So the best is yet to come in terms
Absolutely.
of music in the White House.
Thanks,
John, very much. Great talking with you. Appreciate it.
Likewise.
On behalf of the White House Historical Association, I also want to thank all listeners and viewers of the 1600 Sessions podcast for your dedicated support of our mission. I really enjoy sharing interesting and often untold stories into the White House and its history through these wonderful, insightful conversations. The association is a nonprofit and a nonpartisan organization, and we rely on the support and generosity of private individuals. If you'd like to contribute to the preservation of history and support the work of the White House Historical Association, please visit our website at whitehousehistory.org.